Cathy Rain is a game developed by Clifftop Games, published by Raw Fury, released for PC, both Windows and Mac, courtesy of a review code sent by the developer. It was released on May the 5th of 2016, and there are both DRM and DRM-free versions available.
A mere single pair of boots on display. Boy, do we live in different worlds.
Cathy Rain is a standard pixelated 2D adventure game set in the mid-90s, and it's really budding of LucasArts, and we'll get into that later. Cathy Rain is a story of a budding journalist in college who has to come to terms with her troubled past as she investigates the death of her recently deceased grandfather. The journey will take Cathy Rain to the town of Conwell Springs, where she'll begin to dig into a local mystery surrounding her hometown, taking her on a road full of emotional roller coasters along the way.
I found out that the drowned girl's name was Lily Myers. Ring a bell?
Oh, yes. Oh, how could I forget? Sue, Jack, and their children, Lily and Nathan.
Do they still live around here?
Mother and son do. I see them in town from time to time. They live somewhere near the lake.
But not the father.
Cathy Rain is about as standard a click-a-point adventure game as you can possibly get, except there's actually some improvements to the formula, which is kind of nice. For one, visually, it's actually really nice. There's a few problems with the visuals, and I'm going to mention them from an art standpoint. Now, mind you, I'm not an artist. I don't pretend to be. But these are things that, for future reference, you can improve on. For one, the horizon that they chose, where they chose the horizon for most of the backdrops, is really, 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 really low. Like, it's below the midpoint, which is fine. It's fine if it's below, halfway between, the top and bottom. It's fine if it's lower or upper. The problem is, the character moves, and it moves off because there's a scaling thing. And so when she goes from far back to very forward, it looks really, really, really bad. Like, it looks really off. And it's sad because visually, overall, the game looks really nice. And it is pretty impressive. And Cathy Rain herself is actually kind of an interesting character. Besides that, there's also been huge improvements to the UI and things of that nature. The UI is very simplified. You can only do certain things. And while that may come as a disappointment to some adventure game enthusiasts, I for one take that as a sign of actual improvement, because it's fun to play. Don't get me wrong, I had fun with adventure games in the 90s, but a UI improvement was needed, because I don't need to learn how to open a door. I don't need to learn how to open a person. And the fact that the UI is simplified is really helpful. And overall, it's just a lot more fun to play, and it's a lot more enjoyable to play as a result. However, because of this UI simplification, there are some downsides that I wanted to talk about in terms of the actual game. Cathy Rain as a story is about as in-depth as a Scooby-Doo mystery adventure, even complete, without spoiling anything too big, with a kidnapping of some sort. And so, combine Scooby-Doo mystery with kidnapping, with people disappearing, it's literally a Scooby-Doo mystery adventure, except without the Scooby-Doo gang, and instead replaced with Cathy Rain. So that brings into the question, is Cathy Rain an interesting enough character to hold the game together? Because as a story goes, it's a very good story, sort of. The story works mostly, except towards the end. It does a lot of things that a lot of adventure games in the 90s did wrong, and a lot of storytelling does wrong, which is, there's a mystery. What's the result? Sci-fi, fantasy, otherworldly things you just don't understand. It's a cop-out, basically, and I'm not spoiling anything, but the last 15% or so of the story really feels like a cop-out, complete with dream sequences.
My God, what is this place? What's that? I can see something. Faintly.
Multiple dream sequences, and from a story perspective and from a writing perspective, that's really poor, and there's a lot better ways to tell a story than using dream sequences. And there's a lot better ways to tell backstory and history of a character without A, going back in time, which luckily they don't do, but other, adventure games have done, so I figured I'd mention it. And, of course, dream sequences, which are two really big no-nos in storytelling, because anyone can do a dream sequence. The whole anything can happen in a dream, and A, that's not really true, and B, it's a cop-out for writing. Which is sad, because the other 85% of the story is really well done. The characters are really in-depth, and I really like some of the backstory for the characters, and I really like the voice acting. Most of the voice actors, whoever they are, I'm not gonna... I don't pretend to remember their names, I don't, but whoever did their voice acting for all the characters, they're really good. Even Kathy, Kathy as a story arc, as a character arc, I should say, she has one, but it's very meh, is the best way I can describe it, and I know that's not a good way to describe it, and that, again, is mainly due because of a lot of story cop-outs that they pull. And the character arc I thought she was going to have, which was going to be a lot more interesting, doesn't happen. And I'm not going to spoil any big things for you, but the character arc you're probably expecting Kathy to have, I'll give you a hint, is probably going to happen. And what ends up happening is I just overpredict what stories do, because I often presume stories will take the better route. But Kathy Rain's story doesn't really take that great of a route, and instead does the cop-out story, which isn't a bad thing. It's just, it makes the story really generic at the end, and since most people remember the beginnings and ends of things and not the middle, which is where the story really is its strongest, it kind of brings into a thought, you'll more remember the ending than anything, which is sad because the ending is very meh at best, when in reality the actual story is actually pretty decent, and I enjoyed it. And overall, it's a lot of fun to play through. You'll meet a lot of colorful characters. You'll meet a lot of colorful characters with great voice acting. And it's overall a fun ride to enjoy.
So, why'd they put you in that cell?
It's all just a big misunderstanding.
Is that so?
Yeah, I didn't mean to steal anything. I was just using my pockets to move the beer to the checkout.
That's the worst excuse I have ever heard.
For your information, I happen to have a deadly fear of shopping carts.
I take my last statement back.
Hey, it wasn't your father who was killed by a shopping cart when you were 8.
I sure hope not.
To be fair, mine wasn't either. It was just Uncle Bob. But that doesn't mean it was any less traumatic, mind you. To this day, I still get nervous breakdowns at grocery stores.
I think I've heard enough, buddy.
You're right. We should stop before the flashbacks begin.
Now, there's a few things I wanted to go back on that the story doesn't do. I guess I should correct myself. The adventure game doesn't do like normal adventure games. Unlike games like Monkey Island, unlike other adventure games by LucasArts, there's no specific hub world to the game, and there's a downside to it in Kathy Rain. In Kathy Rain, rather than having a hub world, every time you jump on your motorcycle, you can fast travel to key events and places, and that's good in some respect, but not all respect, if that makes any sense, because you lose the storytelling and the background character design and all the background history of the world and the lore that you'd get if you had a full-size hub world. However, the positives are that you can focus on individual characters, and you can focus on giving each character a unique personality. Not all the characters have a super unique personality. There are clear stereotypes that make it very meh, again, in terms of storytelling, but the voice acting really makes up for it. Some of the voice acting is like a little... the best way to describe it, it's a little muted. You could tell that they were kind of holding back a little, but most of them most of the voice acting, for the most part, is really well done. The audio itself is really well done. The sound effects, for the most part, are, again, really good. And the music is also really well done, and it's really ambient, which works really well for a click-and-point adventure game. And again, the story is more simplified into Kathy's perspective and into Kathy's story, again, because there is no hub world. And so, if you decide to buy this game, you're going to be buying the game for Kathy's story. You're not going to be buying the game for the side quests or the side missions, because they're not here. You're not going to be buying the game for other characters. You're going to be buying the game for Kathy's story. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide if the story of a young rebellious teen journalist stereotype who goes on an adventure that's kind of interesting and then gets more interesting and then sort of falls apart towards the end, you're going to decide if that's worth your $15 or whatever it is at the time of, you listening to this.
She tells everyone who walks in here the same joke. Spoiler alert, the boat sinks. Eileen's schedule. There's a note for today. Help Kathy get in touch with Dave. Eileen's girly suitcase. There's a sticker on it with her full name, Eileen Mildred Summers.
And there are a few cons that I wanted to mention. One of them is different resolution options would be really helpful. Like, seriously, it would be amazing. And I know the game is made in AGS, which a lot of people are probably saying, oh, it's made in a game-making studio, oh god, it's like FPS Creator and RPG Maker all over again. No, trust me, AGS is really good, and you can make some really good AGS games. I believe Yahtzee Croshaw, when he was starting out making games in AGS, like way back, when he was like half the age he is now, Yahtzee had mentioned in one of his videos that he made a shorter game to start off with because a lot of people in the AGS forums would have these grand ambitions and then they'd never complete them. And it is interesting to see a full fleshed out adventure game made in AGS. Again, there's no resolution options, there's very few options in general, there's no controller support, which I wouldn't really expect for an click and point adventure game anyway, but it would be nice to have some different resolution options, some different frame rate options, things of that nature. The options department is really lacking, and, again, the story really does fall apart at the end, and it may leave some players confused. I'm not going to spoil the story, again, I've mostly gone through this spoiler-free, but as a warning, I guess, if you want to call it that, there's something I wanted to talk about, which is, in a certain section of the game, Kathy will find a note, basically, and the note talks about how someone was fighting for Kathy to stay with them from the mother, who basically would lie a lot, and she had to put the mother away or something around those lines. And so she found a note that said how this one particular character was fighting to stay with them so she could be taken care of properly. And she starts crying. And I had assumed it was the dad, because she was so mad at the dad leaving, and Kathy had even mentioned that the mother would lie about the dad, and would lie about people constantly. And so I thought to myself, oh, so this is talking about the dad, and that's why it's going on in that direction, because it's going to talk about how the dad actually wasn't a bad dad, and the dad really did fight to the end, but he just couldn't handle the mother, and so he left. However, it doesn't turn out like that at all, and it more or less turns out to be, oh, it was the grandfather, and that's how the relationship with Kathy and the grandfather comes about. And it's really disjointed, because other than people talking about Kathy and the grandfather's relationship, there really isn't one. There's none visually told, and again, adventure games, you are a visual medium. You have visuals to your advantage, use them, and Kathy Rain doesn't really use it that well to show that relationship. Everyone talks about it, everyone talks about how they're great characters, but it's not really shown that well. And Kathy herself, again, is fairly stereotypical. There are some really cool elements to Kathy's character, but overall she's fairly meh. And as I mentioned in my written review, a lot of things happen around and to Kathy, but Kathy herself doesn't really do anything. She more or less just has reactions to things around her and about her and to her.
I'm gonna find out what happened to you, Grandpa. I promise.
Saying that at the end of the day, Kathy is still an interesting enough character to hold the story together, but I really wonder if you replaced Kathy with another stereotype, if it would work just as well, and I think it would. again, that's just a personal opinion, but I really think if you replaced Kathy and just put Joe Schmo number 972, Joe Schmo number 972 would have fared just as well as Kathy. Kathy doesn't really have anything interesting going on about her that makes her an really interesting character. Things happen to Kathy, and things happen involving Kathy, but Kathy herself doesn't really do anything. And there's very few, despite this being an adventure game, there's very little actual choice involving what Kathy does. It's a very linear story. And so again, you have to kind of look at it and say, well, is a 5-ish hour adventure with Kathy, worth the price of admission? Because it will take around 3 to 5 hours for you to complete the story. And it goes by a day basis. I believe there was 5 or so days in the story, if I recall. And so at the end of the day, is the story worth $15? Because it's not Kathy Rain, it's not the game that's worth the money. Because the game, despite being a fairly well-polished game, especially for an independent developer, at the end of the day, it's the story that you're paying for. And, is the story worth your $15? Or could you get a better story elsewhere for the money? And that's the question you kind of have to ask yourself. Is the adventure with Kathy Rain and the story, the hook, is it a hook enough to get you to spend $15? For us, I think I'd be much happier swallowing the Kathy Rain pill at around $10 or $9. I think $15 is a little much, and so personally, I think it's much easier to swallow the game at a $10 pill, but again, it's up to the player at the end of the day. Personally, I don't think the cons outweigh the pros at all. I think the pros, the story, the music, the voice acting, the simplified UI, which is great, by the way. I'm not being sarcastic. If I know it probably sounds like it, but I'm not being sarcastic. The UI being simplified really is great, and it's so much better, at least for me, when playing adventure games. Because with adventure games, I often get frustrated very easily, and for the most part, Kathy Rain isn't a frustrating game. The only real thing that I guess I should mention are the puzzles. They exist because it's an adventure game. They feel like they exist because it's an adventure game. And they're not good, they're not bad, they simply exist. Most of them you can get over pretty quickly, and it's really easy to understand what to do, but you might need to think about a few puzzles. For example, one of the puzzles was getting a password from a computer, and then you had to do it again, but I had forgot you had an item that could do that, and when it had mentioned it, I thought it was talking about, how the username and password is structured, when in reality it was just, use this thing and get the password and username. And I was like, well, that's kind of stupid. But overall, the puzzles aren't bad, they're just there. They don't really deter from the gameplay, at least not enough for me to hate them, but they don't feel like they're... How should I put it? They don't feel like they're there enough, if that makes sense. They don't feel in the story enough to really feel like if you took them out, you'd be losing something of the story. And they don't feel like they're out of place, if that makes sense. They're in a very, iffy category. They're not bad, but they're not really that great either. There is some cool elements, like the puzzle elements, I should say, actually have multiple uses, and not only that, one of the computers you use to get a password and things of that nature, it's actually used to pull the story along, and there are a few puzzles like that, not a lot, but a few, and those are the types of puzzles in Kathy Rain that are actually really nice. At the end of the day, Kathy Rain is a pixelated 2D adventure game, and it's fairly standard. It feels like a LucasArts, or late Sierra adventure game. And at the end of that day, is the story in Kathy Rain enough to pull you in? Because it's not the voice acting or the music or the simplified UI that's going to pull you in. And it's not going to be the side missions that aren't there, or the hub world, or all the other interesting side characters. It's going to be Kathy Rain and Kathy Rain's story. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the buyer, the player, the consumer, whoever you want to call them. It's going to be them that decide, is the story good enough to warrant a purchase. I think it's much more certain of a purchase at a $10 price tag. If the game reaches $10, I'd say go buy it in a heartbeat, because the story is fairly good up until the end, and all the characters are really nice. Some of them are stereotypes, yes, but the voice acting, for the most part, makes up for it, and the simplified UI means you can focus on Kathy and Kathy's story without getting old adventure game tropes in the way. So, at the end of the day, do I think Kathy Rain is worth $14.99? It's going to depend highly. I don't think it's a good enough story to, for me to swallow that pill, but it is still a fairly well done and fairly well polished game, and it's going to be up to the player whether they decide if it's worth the $14.99 price tag. This has been Yourwolfsdengaming with an overview of Kathy Rain, and we hope you enjoy and have a good one, ladies and gentlemen. Kathy Rain is a game developed... Let's try that again. Kathy Rain is a game developed by Clifftop Games and published by Raw Fury. It is released for the PC, both Windows and Mac. It has DRM and DRM-free versions. It was released on May the 5th of 2016, and it has an MRS... God fucking damn it. The fucking lisps. Let's try that again. Alright. There we go. Kathy Rain is a game developed by Clifftop Games, published by Raw Fury, and it was released for PC, i.e. Windows and Mac. God fucking damn, why we don't read off the script. This is why I stopped writing. Let's try that again. There we go. Kathy Rain is a game developed by Clifftop Games and published by Raw Fury. It was released for PC, both Windows and Mac, and we're going to be reviewing the PC version today, the Windows version. There's DRM and DRM-free versions available. It was released on May the 5th of 2016, and it's going for an MSRP price of $14.99. And yes, we did get a copy from the actual developer, so we didn't go out and buy the game, unfortunately. God fucking... Oh god, I'm tired. Let's try that again.